The plain stretched wide and endless, the wind carrying the scent of dust and sagebrush, as if time itself had settled still over the small frontier town that rested against the horizon. In those days, life moved slower but harder, with every man and woman carving their survival out of the earth with their own hands. Wooden buildings leaned under the weight of years, the saloon's doors swinging with the rhythm of boots and laughter, while the church bell tolled faintly in the distance as though to remind folks that even here, on the edge of civilization, heaven was still watching. It was a place where every secret carried weight, and every word had the power to shift the ground beneath a person's feet. That afternoon was like many others, though the air carried a tension you could almost taste. Dust rose from the wagon trails where horses pawed impatiently, and the sun hung low enough to cast long, shadowy fingers over the town's main street. The sheriff leaned on a post outside his office, squinting at the road as if waiting for something or someone to appear. Men muttered under their breath at the blacksmith's shop, and women traded quiet gossip near the mercantile. It was the kind of quiet that wasn't peaceful, but expectant, like the hush before a storm. It was into this hush that a young cowboy rode, his hat tipped low, his frame lean and weathered from weeks on the trail. He carried the look of someone who had seen too much too soon, and yet there was a restless light in his eyes that made folks stop and notice. His boots hit the dirt with the kind of certainty that said he was not afraid of stares or whispers. He had a way of carrying himself that stirred unease in some and curiosity in others. No one knew his full story, but there were always guesses, and in a town like this, guesses turned to stories, and stories into truths whether they were earned or not. What caught him off guard wasn't the townsfolk, nor the sharp eyes of the sheriff. It was the woman who stood at the edge of the general store, her figure framed by the doorway, her gaze steady, unflinching. She was no girl. Life had carved lines around her eyes and etched grace into the way she held herself. She was a widow, and everyone knew it. The loss of her husband years ago had left her with both land and whispers. Some said she was strong, others said she was stubborn. Either way, she had lived on her own terms, and that carried a weight of its own. She had been seen before, of course, going about her business with little fuss, but on this day, it was different. Her eyes held the cowboy longer than what was proper. Her lips, painted faintly with a hint of color, curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, but not a dismissal either. The townsfolk noticed it too, though they pretended not to. In small towns, silence was never empty. It was full of judgment, curiosity, and speculation waiting to take root. The young cowboy tipped his hat politely, intending to walk past without much thought, but the widow's voice cut through the murmurs around them. It was clear, steady, and carried enough weight to still the restless shuffle of boots and the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer. "Is your mind always on what's under my skirt?" she said, her tone neither playful nor harsh, but sharp enough to slice through the air. Every head turned. The sheriff straightened, the blacksmith paused mid-swing, and the whispers that usually rolled quiet through the town stopped cold. The cowboy froze, his jaw tightening, unsure whether he had just been accused, teased, or tested. The widow didn't flinch. Her eyes stayed locked on his, daring him to answer, daring him to move. She had spoken loud enough for all to hear, but quiet enough that her words lingered like a challenge meant for him alone. The silence after stretched so thin it could have broken with a single breath. What no one could see in that moment was the story behind those words. To some, it sounded like provocation, a woman daring a stranger. To others, it was scandalous, proof of what they had whispered about her all along. But to the widow herself, those words carried something far deeper. Her life had been one of loss and resilience, of learning to hold her ground in a world that tried to sweep her aside. She had watched men underestimate her, pity her, or seek to take from her what wasn't theirs to claim. And now, in the face of this young cowboy's quiet fire, she had spoken not just to test him, but to measure him. The cowboy's chest rose slowly as he fought to steady his breath. His eyes searched hers, as if trying to decide whether she was mocking him, challenging him, or offering him a truth he wasn't yet ready to hear. The crowd leaned on their heels, waiting for him to speak, waiting for the moment to shatter the silence that had gripped them all. But he didn't answer, not yet. Instead, he shifted his weight, his boots pressing deeper into the dirt, his fingers twitching near his belt as though he was caught between walking away and standing his ground. The sheriff's hand moved close to his holster, ready in case the tension broke the wrong way. The widow's lips curved slightly again, but her eyes never softened. The air grew heavier with each second, the sun dropping lower, painting the sky in streaks of fire as though the land itself was holding its breath. Somewhere, a horse stamped its hoof against the wooden hitch, the sound cracking through the silence like a warning. The cowboy finally parted his lips, though no words came yet. His gaze lingered on the widow, his thoughts unreadable, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. The townsfolk leaned closer, hungry for whatever would come next, because in that single exchange, those few words, something had shifted. It wasn't just about a question asked in public. It was about pride, secrets, and a story that was about to unravel in ways no one in that quiet frontier town could have imagined. And as the evening crept in, with the first star daring to appear in the fading sky, the air held a promise of what was coming, a collision of two lives, two pasts, and a truth that would not stay hidden. Whether it would bring ruin or redemption was a question no one could yet answer, least of all the young cowboy who now stood frozen beneath the weight of the widow's unflinching stare. The silence broke only with the restless shuffle of boots and the murmur of voices returning to life, yet the moment lingered like smoke in the air. The widow turned, her skirt catching in the breeze as she stepped back into the shadows of the store, leaving the cowboy with the weight of her words hanging heavy on his shoulders. He stood there, torn between pride and curiosity, between walking away and following her into the unknown. And in that hesitation, the town itself seemed to lean forward, waiting to see which path he would choose, knowing that whichever way he stepped, nothing would ever be quite the same again. The young cowboy stood in the dust of the street long after the widow's figure disappeared into the shadows of the store. Her words still rang in his ears, burning hotter than the sun that was sliding behind the ridges. He had faced storms on the trail, men with guns drawn, and nights when hunger gnawed at him harder than wolves. But nothing had unsettled him quite like the challenge in her eyes. It wasn't just the words she spoke. It was the weight behind them. He tipped his hat lower, trying to mask the thoughts flickering across his face, but he could feel the stares still pressing on him. The sheriff hadn't moved far, his gaze sharp and curious, like a man measuring trouble before it had time to take root. A couple of old men outside the saloon exchanged quiet remarks, while women near the mercantile pretended to busy themselves with baskets and bolts of cloth. The young cowboy knew their whispers would ripple through the town by sundown. In a place this small, gossip spread faster than wildfire, and he had just become part of it. He turned slowly and walked toward the hitching post where his horse waited. Each step stirred dust, but inside him there was a storm. He told himself he had no reason to care what a widow thought or what the town made of her words. Yet something about her tone, her steady gaze, pulled at him like a hook set deep. He had come here looking only for a night's rest, maybe supplies before the next stretch of the trail. Instead, he found himself caught in a web before he even set foot in the saloon. As he loosened the reins, the sheriff called out, "You planning to stay the night, cowboy?" The young man paused, sensing the weight of the question. The sheriff's tone wasn't unfriendly, but it wasn't open either. It was the kind of tone that asked more than it seemed to. He gave a short nod. "Maybe. Depends on the welcome." The sheriff's lips pressed into a thin line, as if weighing that answer. "This town don't take kindly to trouble. Keep that in mind." The cowboy didn't argue. He swung up into the saddle and guided his horse toward the boarding house at the edge of town. Yet even as he rode away, his eyes flicked back once toward the store where the widow had vanished. The boarding house was run by an older woman with tired eyes but a kind smile. She gave him a room upstairs, the kind with creaking floors and a narrow bed. As he laid his hat on the dresser, the silence of the room pressed in. Outside, he could hear the faint clatter of wagons and the distant laughter spilling from the saloon, but his thoughts kept circling back to the widow's voice. He leaned against the window, watching the sky grow darker. Something about her didn't fit the neat picture folks painted of her. A woman who had lived through loss, who owned her land, who stood her ground against whispers, that much was plain. But why had she spoken those words to him, a stranger she had never seen before? Was it a warning, a taunt, or something else entirely? The truth was, the cowboy had secrets of his own. His journey hadn't been a simple one, and every mile behind him carried shadows he hadn't outrun. He had learned to keep his head low, to move quick, and never let anyone close enough to ask questions. Yet here he was, restless in a room he had only just taken, thinking of a woman who had unsettled him with a single sentence. The next morning, the town was already buzzing when he stepped outside. The widow's words had spread, and everywhere he went, eyes followed him. At the blacksmith's shop, men stopped hammering to look. At the well, women paused their chatter. Even children stared, though they didn't understand why. He tried to shake it off, to walk steady, but he knew he had been marked. He ended up at the saloon by midday, pushing through the swinging doors into the dim, smoky air. Cards slapped against wood, coins clinked, and the piano in the corner carried a tune too slow to be cheerful. He ordered a drink, though not for thirst. He needed the burn to quiet the noise in his head. It wasn't long before someone slid into the chair opposite him. It was a man older than him, with gray at his temples and a sly look in his eyes. He leaned forward, resting an elbow on the table. "Word is you caught the widow's tongue yesterday," the man said. "She don't waste words without a reason. Careful you don't end up tangled in something you can't walk out of." The cowboy studied him for a moment before answering. "I didn't ask for her words. Maybe not. But you got M just the same." The man gave a thin smile. "And in this town, that means something." The cowboy didn't reply. He took a slow sip of his drink, but the man's warning sank deeper than he wanted to admit. Later that day, he found himself outside the mercantile again, though he hadn't planned it. The widow was there, speaking with the storekeeper, her hands folded neatly over a small parcel. She didn't look at him at first, but he felt her presence the way one feels heat from a fire. When her eyes finally turned toward him, there was no surprise, no hesitation, only the same steady wait as before. He wanted to walk past, but his boots stopped of their own accord. She stepped closer, her voice calm, low enough so only he could hear. "You've brought questions with you, cowboy. This town has a way of finding answers, whether you want them or not." He frowned slightly. "And what answers do you think they'll find?" Her gaze lingered on him, searching, as though peeling back the layers he kept hidden. "The kind that don't stay buried." Before he could reply, she turned, walking away with a quiet dignity that seemed stitched into every step she took. He stood there, caught between anger and curiosity, unsure whether to leave town or follow the pull that kept dragging him back toward her. As night fell again, the saloon grew louder, the streets dimmer, and the shadows longer. The young cowboy sat outside his room, a cigarette burning slowly between his fingers, and thought of the path that had brought him here. He had told himself he was just passing through, yet the widow's voice had left a mark he couldn't shake. What unsettled him most wasn't her words spoken in front of the whole town, but the truth he thought he glimpsed behind them. It was as if she knew something about him, something he hadn't spoken aloud. That idea gnawed at him, stirring the unease he usually managed to bury beneath the miles of the trail. The town had gone quiet by the time he finally laid down, but sleep didn't come easy. His mind replayed the look in her eyes, the sheriff's steady watch, and the warning from the man in the saloon. He could feel the ground shifting under him, though he couldn't yet see which way it would give. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, long and low, breaking the silence of the night. He turned over, staring at the ceiling, knowing dawn would bring more questions than answers. And though he tried to push the thought away, he couldn't help but wonder if the widow's words had been less of a question and more of a prophecy he had no choice but to face. The next chapter of his story was waiting in the shadows, and no matter how far he had ridden, he could not ride past this. Not now. Not with the weight of the widow's eyes still pressing against his heart. The young cowboy woke to the sound of voices outside his window, low and urgent, as if the town itself had stirred before the sun had fully risen. He sat up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, and listened. The words were too faint to catch clearly, but the tone was sharp. It was the kind of tone that belonged to arguments whispered in corners, the kind that carried secrets heavy enough to break a man's back. He pushed himself up and leaned against the window frame, watching as two men crossed the street, their shoulders hunched, their eyes darting. One of them glanced back toward the boarding house before disappearing down the alley. The cowboy knew that look. He had worn it himself once or twice on the trail when he carried something he wished no one would see. By the time he stepped outside, the morning light had begun to spread across the dirt road, turning the dust golden. The town looked almost peaceful in that glow, but the quiet was a thin mask stretched over something restless. He saddled his horse, not because he was leaving, but because he wanted the weight of the reins in his hands, something steady in a place that felt less steady by the hour. As he worked, he caught sight of the widow walking across the street, a basket in her arm. Her posture was as straight as ever, her chin lifted as though she had learned long ago not to bow to whispers. She noticed him too. For a heartbeat, their eyes held, and it felt as if she could see more of him than he allowed anyone. She didn't speak this time. She only gave the slightest nod before carrying on. But the look she left him with stayed, as if she were reminding him that the story between them hadn't ended, only begun. Later that morning, the cowboy walked into the saloon again, though he knew it was dangerous to draw more eyes. The man with the gray at his temples was there, the one who had warned him before. He leaned against the bar, his hat tipped back, watching the room with the ease of a man who missed nothing. When he spotted the cowboy, he waved him over. "You didn't take my warning," the man said, his voice low. "I don't run from words," the cowboy answered. The man smirked, but it wasn't with amusement. "Words are what ruin men here, stranger, not bullets. Not knives. Words." He glanced toward the door. "That widow's name carries more of them than you know." The cowboy frowned. "What's her story?" The man studied him carefully, as if deciding how much truth he could risk sharing. "Her husband died sudden. Some say accident, some say not. She kept the land, though most men expected her to sell it off. She's been standing alone ever since. That makes her strong, sure, but it also makes her a target. And anyone who crosses her path ends up tangled in the talk she drags behind her." The cowboy took that in, but it didn't settle his unease. If anything, it only deepened it. He could sense that the man wasn't telling everything. There was more hidden, the kind of story folks carried like contraband too dangerous to speak out loud. Before he could press, the saloon doors creaked open and the sheriff stepped in. His boots rang against the wood, and silence fell heavy. His eyes landed on the cowboy, holding there a second too long. Then he turned to the room and spoke. "Town meeting tonight. Everyone comes. No excuses." No one argued. When the sheriff left, the murmur of voices rose again, thicker now, edged with unease. A town meeting in a place like this wasn't routine. It meant something had stirred deep enough that no one could ignore it. The cowboy walked out soon after, his thoughts heavy. He found himself wandering toward the edge of town, where the land stretched into open fields. There, he saw the widow standing by a fence, her hands resting on the wood as she looked out at her land. He hesitated before stepping closer. "You planning to speak at this meeting?" he asked, his voice breaking the quiet. She didn't turn right away. When she did, her face was unreadable. "I always speak when it concerns me. And in this town, it often does." He studied her for a moment, the way the light caught the lines of her face, the steadiness in her voice. "The talk says you carry more secrets than most." Her lips curved faintly, though it wasn't a smile. "Talk is cheap. What matters is who dares to listen and who dares to act." She stepped closer then, her eyes holding his with that same quiet force that had unsettled him since the first day. "Why are you really here, Cowboy?" Men don't ride into towns like this without a reason. The question struck harder than he expected. For a moment, he thought of the trail behind him, the debts left unpaid, the faces he didn't want to remember, the choices that had driven him farther west with every mile. He wanted to answer, but he couldn't. Not yet. So he only said, "Maybe I'm looking for something I don't yet understand." The widow studied him a long moment, as if weighing that answer before turning back toward her land. "Then be careful what you find. This town doesn't forgive easily." That night, the meeting filled the church. Every bench was crowded, the air thick with tension. The sheriff stood at the front, his jaw set, his hand resting on the table beside him. The widow sat near the aisle, her back straight, her eyes sharp. The cowboy slipped in quietly, taking a place near the back where shadows clung. The sheriff's voice carried across the room. "There's been talk of rustlers near the edge of town. Cattle missing, fences cut. That's trouble enough. But there's more." He paused, letting the silence hang before continuing. "Supplies gone missing from the mercantile, money unaccounted for. And some of you have been pointing fingers where you shouldn't." The murmur rose immediately, voices sharp, accusing, fearful. The cowboy caught the widow's face in the flickering lantern light. She sat still, calm, though he could see the tension in her jaw. A man across the room stood suddenly, pointing toward her. "Maybe it's her. She's always kept more than she needs. Maybe she's been trading with those rustlers." Gasps and shouts filled the room, the sheriff slamming his hand down to restore order. The widow stood slowly, her voice steady when she finally spoke. "You think I need thieves to keep me alive? My land feeds me. My work sustains me. If you've lost what's yours, look to your own doors before you look to mine." Her words cut through the noise, but the suspicion lingered, hanging in the air like smoke. The cowboy watched closely, feeling the weight of it settle not just on her, but on himself. Because now, without choosing it, he had been drawn into the orbit of her fight. When the meeting broke and the crowd spilled into the night, voices still sharp with accusation, the cowboy lingered in the shadows. He could see the sheriff speaking quietly to the widow, his face unreadable, her posture stiff. He couldn't hear their words, but he didn't need to. The divide in the town was clear, and the widow stood at the heart of it. As he walked back toward the boarding house, his mind turned over every word, every look. The town was not just restless, it was cracking, and he had stepped into it at the worst possible time. He knew he could leave, ride out before dawn, disappear before the storm broke. But he also knew he wouldn't. Something in the widow's eyes, in her defiance against the tide of suspicion, had tied him here. The night stretched long, and sleep came thin. Somewhere in the dark, he realized the truth he hadn't wanted to face. The conflict wasn't only hers anymore. It was his too. And whatever shadows he had been running from were now colliding with the shadows that haunted this town. The story was no longer about passing through. It was about survival and about the secrets that refused to stay buried. And as dawn approached, he knew the widow's challenge from that first day still hung between them, unanswered, sharp as ever, waiting to strike again. The night after the town meeting, The young cowboy lay awake in his narrow bed, staring at the dark ceiling while the floor creaked faintly beneath the restless wind. Every sound outside felt sharper than it should have been: the shuffle of boots in the street, the whinny of a horse tied too long, even the rattle of a loose shutter in the boarding-house hall. He could not shake the echo of the voices that had filled the church. The widow's name had been dragged into suspicion, and though she had stood firm, the doubt in the eyes of the townsfolk lingered like a stain that would not wash away. He sat up before dawn, unable to rest, and stepped outside into the cool air. The streets were empty except for the sheriff, who leaned on the corner post, arms folded across his chest. His gaze flicked toward the cowboy, then back down the street. "You're sticking around," the sheriff said, not as a question but as a statement. "For now," the cowboy answered, his voice flat. The sheriff studied him a moment longer, his eyes sharp. "For her?" The cowboy didn't answer. Silence stretched between them until the sheriff gave a small nod, as if he'd confirmed what he already suspected. "Then you'd best understand this. The rustlers ain't the only trouble here. Secrets in this town cut deeper than any blade. Don't get yourself caught on the wrong side of one." The cowboy said nothing, but the warning stuck. He knew the sheriff wasn't speaking only of the widow. As the sun rose, the town came alive again, though the air carried a new edge. Men gathered in knots outside the saloon, their voices low. Women carried baskets through the mercantile with tighter grips than usual, their eyes darting to corners. Even the children played quieter, sensing the heaviness in the air. The cowboy walked slowly through it all, every step reminding him he was now part of a story that was tightening like a noose. When he passed the blacksmith's shop, the old man hammered harder than necessary, sparks flying in the morning light. "Best be careful, stranger," the blacksmith muttered without looking up. "This town's hunger for blame is sharper than any tool I make." The cowboy didn't reply. He kept walking until he found himself outside the widow's land. The wide fields stretched gold under the early sun, fences standing tall though some carried the marks of recent mending. He leaned against a post, waiting, and before long he saw her emerge from the barn, her skirts brushing the dust as she carried a bucket of feed. She looked strong and steady, but he could see the tiredness behind her eyes. "You're here early," she said, setting the bucket down. "Couldn't sleep," he admitted. "Too much noise in my head." She gave him a long look. "That's the noise that matters most, the kind you can't ride away from." He watched her scatter the feed, chickens flocking around her feet. "They're saying more now," he said quietly. "Not just about the rustlers. About you. About your land." Her hands paused for only a moment before she straightened, her jaw set. "They've always said things. It's easier to blame a widow than to face the truth staring at them in the mirror." The cowboy stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Then tell me the truth. What really happened to your husband?" Her eyes met his sharply, as if his words had struck a wound she guarded close. For a long moment she didn't speak, the silence between them stretching taut. Finally, she said, "Truth is never simple. Not here. He's gone, and the land is mine. That's all most folks need to know." "But not all," the cowboy pressed. Her lips tightened. "No, not all." Before more could be said, a rider appeared on the horizon, galloping hard. The dust rose behind him as he approached, pulling up at the fence. His horse panted, foam on its mouth, as he shouted. "Sheriff wants everyone at the edge of town. Cattle's been taken again. Tracks lead toward the widow's land." The cowboy felt the air turn heavy. The widow's face didn't change much, but he saw her grip tighten on the fence rail, her knuckles white. Without a word, she turned back toward the barn, her shoulders straight, her chin lifted. When they reached the edge of town, a crowd had already gathered. The sheriff stood at the front, pointing toward the trampled grass where tracks cut deep into the soil. "See here," he called out, "this is where the herd was driven. And see how close it runs to her land. Murmurs rose quickly, voices sharp with accusation. "It's her!" someone shouted. "She's in with them rustlers." Others chimed in, their faces twisted with fear and anger. The widow stepped forward, her voice strong. "You see tracks, nothing more. I've worked this land alone. I've asked nothing from any of you, and I'd sooner die than deal with thieves." But the crowd was restless, their hunger for blame rising with every word. The sheriff raised his hand for silence, though his eyes never left the widow's. The cowboy pushed his way forward, his voice steady but firm. "Tracks don't tell you who made them. You want proof, not guesses. Guessing's what gets innocent folks hung." The sheriff's eyes narrowed, measuring him, but he didn't answer. The crowd shifted uneasily, their suspicion now divided between the widow and the stranger who defended her. That night, the town buzzed like a hive split open. Rumors flew faster than fire, twisting into shapes that grew darker with each retelling. Some said the widow had killed her husband to keep his land. Others whispered she was hiding stolen cattle in her barn. And still others swore the cowboy had ridden into town not by chance, but because he was one of the rustlers himself. The cowboy sat in the saloon, his back to the wall, listening. Every glance cast his way felt like a blade. Every laugh carried suspicion behind it. When the gray-templed man slid into the chair across from him again, the cowboy was already braced. "You see it now," the man said quietly. "This town don't need truth. It needs someone to carry the weight of its fear. Right now, that's her. And if you keep standing beside her, it'll be you too." The cowboy leaned forward, his eyes hard. "Then maybe it's time someone showed them fear don't make truth." The man gave a grim smile. "Careful. The last one who tried that ended up buried without a name. Later." As the cowboy walked back toward the boarding house, he caught sight of a shadow slipping near the widow's land. He followed, moving quiet, until he saw two figures at her barn prying at the door. His hand went to the grip of his revolver, but before he could act, the widow herself appeared, lantern in hand. "What are you doing on my land?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the night. The men froze, then bolted, disappearing into the dark before either she or the cowboy could stop them. She turned, her eyes finding him in the shadows. "You see now," she said, her voice low but steady, "this isn't about cattle. This is about driving me off this land." The cowboy stepped closer, his jaw tight. "And they'll come harder next time." Her eyes didn't waver. "Then we'd better be ready." The tension in the town thickened in the days that followed, every glance sharper, every whisper louder. The sheriff's watch grew heavier, his eyes shadowed by something he wasn't saying. The crowd's suspicion grew into something uglier, ready to spill into violence at the first spark. And through it all, the widow and the cowboy stood on a line drawn by forces neither had chosen, but both could no longer avoid. The question was no longer whether the truth would come out, it was how much it would cost when it did. The storm had gathered. The only thing left was the breaking. The storm broke sooner than anyone expected. It came not with thunder or rain, but with fire in the eyes of men too restless, too afraid of shadows to stop and think. The night after the men had been caught near the widow's barn, the town gathered again. Not in a church this time, but in the street, lanterns burning and voices raised. The air carried the bitter smell of kerosene, the dust stirred by boots pounding against the ground. Fear had become anger, and anger had turned into a mob. The young cowboy stood at the edge of the crowd, his jaw tight, his hand resting close to the grip of his revolver. He could feel the pull of what was coming, and it twisted his stomach. He had seen men lose themselves to fear before on the trail, but here it was worse. Here it was neighbors turning on neighbors, folks who had broken bread together now throwing words sharp as knives. At the center of it all was the widow, standing on her porch with her lantern held high, her back straight, her face pale but unflinching. The sheriff tried to speak, his voice booming over the crowd, but few listened. They had decided in their hearts that someone had to be blamed, and they had chosen her. A man shouted that her land was cursed, that cattle had been seen near her fences, that her husband's death had never been natural. The words spread like sparks through dry grass, igniting more voices, more accusations. The cowboy pushed forward, his voice breaking through the roar. "Enough," he shouted. "You've got no proof. You're chasing ghosts because you don't want to see what's in front of you." The sheriff turned, his eyes locking on the cowboy, and for a moment it seemed as if he might finally speak the truth he had been holding back. Instead, he only said, "Let him speak." The crowd shifted, restless, their faces half hidden in the lantern light. The cowboy stood tall, his hat brim casting a shadow across his eyes. "Tracks don't tell you who made them. Whispers don't tell you who stole from you. You're blaming a woman who's done nothing but work harder than any of you to keep what's hers. Maybe the rustlers are smart enough to use her land to cover their trail. Maybe some of you know more about it than you're saying. But if you think driving her off will solve your problems, you're fools." The words cut, but he could see some faces waver, doubt creeping in where anger had ruled. Still, others clenched their fists tighter, unwilling to let go of their fury. The widow stepped forward then, her lantern lighting her face. "You want truth?" she said, her voice steady though her hands trembled slightly. "Here it is. My husband didn't die by accident. He was killed by men who wanted this land. Men who thought I'd be too weak to keep it. I buried him with my own hands, and I swore I'd never let them take from me what he left behind. If you believe I'd ever join the very kind who stole him from me, then you know nothing of me at all." A hush fell, heavy and thick. The crowd shifted again, whispers passing like wind. The sheriff finally stepped forward, his face drawn tight. "She speaks the truth," he said, his voice low but certain. "I've known it for years. But I held it back because proof was scarce, and the men who did it had friends in high places. Maybe that was my mistake. Maybe it's time the truth is told plain." The cowboy watched the sheriff closely, saw the weight he carried in that moment. Secrets long buried were finally dragged into the open. The sheriff's words cracked the mob's unity. Some muttered uneasily, some turned away, unwilling to meet the widow's eyes. A few still clung to anger, but their voices grew weaker, drowned out by the shifting tide. Then came a sound from the darkness beyond the edge of town horses, many of them, their hooves pounding the earth in rhythm. The crowd stiffened, heads whipping toward the noise. Out of the night rode a band of men, their faces shadowed, their rifles glinting in the lantern light. Rustlers. The truth snapped into focus. They had been hiding nearby all along, watching the town tear itself apart. Now they came to finish the job. Shots rang out, sparks exploding in the dark as chaos erupted. The crowd scattered, screams mixing with gunfire, lanterns crashing to the dirt. The sheriff drew his weapon, firing steady, his voice barking orders. The cowboy was already moving, his revolver out, his body cutting through the chaos as he fought toward the widow. She had not run. She stood on her porch, lantern smashed at her feet, eyes locked on the riders storming into the street. He reached her side just as one of the rustlers leveled his rifle, and with a sharp crack, the cowboy's bullet dropped the man from his horse. The fight that followed was a blur of fire and dust. The townsfolk, driven by desperation, turned their fear into fury against the true enemy. Men who had shouted accusations hours before now stood shoulder to shoulder, firing into the dark. Women dragged children into cellars, some returning with shotguns of their own. The sheriff fought like a man trying to erase years of silence, his face grim, his aim true. When the dust finally settled, the street was littered with the bodies of rustlers, their horses scattered into the night. A few townsfolk had fallen too, and the sobs of their kin rose into the smoky air. But the widow still stood, her face streaked with ash, her eyes blazing with the fire of survival. The sheriff stepped forward, his voice hoarse. "It's done. They're gone. And let no one here ever doubt again where the blame belonged. He turned to the widow, his hat in his hands. You've carried the weight of this alone too long. I should have spoken sooner. The widow didn't answer right away. She only looked at the town, the faces weary and ashamed, before finally saying, Then let this be the last time lies are louder than truth. In the days that followed, the town began to rebuild itself. Fences were mended, graves were dug, and whispers turned into apologies spoken with downcast eyes. The widow kept her land, stronger than ever, though the scars of that night would remain. The sheriff carried himself differently too, less burdened by silence, more open in his duty. And the young cowboy, though still a stranger, was no longer seen as an outsider. He stayed long enough to see the worst of the wounds heal, but he knew he would not remain forever. His life was the trail, the horizon always pulling him onward. On his last morning, he saddled his horse while the widow watched from her porch. She didn't ask him to stay, and he didn't promise to return. But their eyes held for a long moment, saying what words could not. You changed more than you know, she told him quietly. He tipped his hat, the faintest smile touching his lips. Maybe, or maybe I just happened to ride in at the right time. With that, he mounted up, the sun rising behind him as he guided his horse down the road. The widow stood there until he was only a speck against the wide horizon. The town quiet once more, but changed, perhaps forever. And though the dust swallowed his trail, the story of the widow and the young cowboy lingered in the hearts of those who had seen it. A reminder that truth has a way of surviving that fear cannot hold forever, and that sometimes a stranger carries the spark needed to light a fire strong enough to drive out the dark. In the end, the land remained, the widow endured, and the cowboy's journey carried him onward, his place in the story sealed not by words alone, but by the choices he had made when the night was at its darkest. And in that, there was a lesson the town would not soon forget, that courage is not the absence of fear, but the will to stand against it when all else falters.